Marco never expected that a simple knock on his door would shatter the careful balance of his life. It was a quiet night, the kind that stretched endlessly when Daniel was away. The apartment felt hollow without him, just a low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Marco had been lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, half watching a show he wasn't really paying attention to. Then the knock. Firm, purposeful. Marco frowned. It was late, too late for visitors. He pulled himself off the couch and made his way to the door, hesitating for a second before unlocking it. Standing on the other side was Logan, broad-shouldered, tall, dressed in his navy blue uniform. The dim porch light caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the shadow of stubble lining his face. "Evening," Logan said, his voice deep and composed. His gaze flicked over Marco, quick but deliberate. Marco swallowed, suddenly aware that he was in nothing but sweatpants and a thin T-shirt that clung to his torso. "Hi, can I help you?" There was a noise complaint in the neighborhood, Logan explained, shifting his weight slightly. "I'm making rounds, checking in. You alone here?" The question was casual, but something about the way he asked it sent a shiver through Marco's spine. "My boyfriend's out of town," Marco replied, watching for any flicker of reaction. Logan just nodded, stepping a little closer. "Mind if I take a look around? Just procedure." Marco knew there was no real reason for it, but he stepped aside anyway, letting the officer in. Logan moved through the space with quiet confidence, his boots clicking against the hardwood. Marco caught himself watching. The way Logan carried himself, solid, assured, completely in control, felt different from Daniel's polished, predictable presence. Marco's relationship with Daniel had always been steady, secure. But there was something about the way Logan's presence filled the room that unsettled him. "You live here long?" Logan asked, glancing over at the framed photos on the bookshelf. Pictures of Marco and Daniel, smiling, caught in moments of happiness that suddenly felt distant. "Almost 3 years," Marco said. Logan nodded again. "Nice place." He turned, his gaze settling on Marco in a way that felt just a second too long to be professional. Marco felt his pulse quicken. "I guess everything looks in order," Logan finally said, stepping toward the door. But he hesitated, his fingers resting lightly on the doorknob. "You should be careful, staying here alone. Never know who might show up." The words weren't a threat, but they weren't exactly innocent either. Marco's throat felt dry. "I can take care of myself." Logan's lips curled slightly, as if he was amused by that. Then, after another lingering moment, he pulled open the door. The night air rushed in, cool against Marco's skin. "If you ever need anything," Logan said, pausing just outside, "call me." And then he was gone. Marco stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, heart hammering in his chest. It was nothing, a routine visit, a harmless conversation. So why did it feel like something had just begun? Marco told himself it was nothing, a routine visit, a harmless exchange, a cop just doing his job. And yet, a week later, he was still thinking about Logan. The memory of that night replayed in his head more often than he was willing to admit. The firm way Logan spoke, the way his gaze had lingered just a little too long. Marco hated how easily it stirred something in him. Daniel was still away, texting every night, calling when he could. "I miss you," he'd say, his voice warm, familiar. But Marco felt restless, unsettled, like something inside him had shifted. That restlessness led him to a cafe downtown late one evening, hoping a change of scenery would quiet his thoughts. He was stirring a coffee he barely wanted when a shadow passed over his table. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Marco looked up. Logan. He wasn't in uniform this time, just dark jeans and a fitted black T-shirt that clung to his chest. He looked even taller out of uniform, his presence just as commanding. Marco forced a casual shrug. "I live in the city. What are the chances?" Logan smirked, but didn't move away. "Mind if I sit?" Marco hesitated, but nodded. Logan lowered himself into the seat across from him, stretching out his legs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Logan broke the silence. "You live with your boyfriend, right?" Marco's grip on his cup tightened. Yeah. Logan tilted his head slightly, studying him. You happy? The question landed heavier than it should have. Marco blinked. Why would you ask that? Logan shrugged. Just making conversation. Marco knew it was more than that. There was something in Logan's tone, in his eyes, a quiet challenge. He could have shut it down, could have walked away. But instead, he found himself leaning in just a little. What makes you think I'm not? Logan didn't answer. He just smiled, slow and knowing. It should have ended there. Marco should have gotten up, left, gone home. But when Logan casually mentioned a bar a few blocks away, nothing fancy, just a quiet place to grab a drink, Marco didn't say no. He told himself it was just conversation, just two people passing the time. But the moment they walked into the dimly lit bar, the air between them changed. They sat in a booth near the back, the low lighting casting shadows over Logan's sharp features. Marco tried to ignore how close they were. The scent of his cologne, the way his arm rested along the back of the booth, dangerously near. They talked about nothing, about everything. Logan was easy to talk to, easier than he should have been. At some point, Marco ordered another drink. Logan smirked. Trying to loosen up? Marco met his gaze, bold now. Do I need to? Logan chuckled, tilting his glass toward him. Guess we'll find out. The shift happened slowly, so slowly that Marco almost convinced himself it was nothing. A brush of Logan's fingers when he reached for his drink, the way their knees bumped on the table, and neither of them moved away. Until suddenly, Marco felt the weight of Logan's hand on his thigh. A slow, deliberate touch. Marco's breath hitched. His first instinct was to pull away. His second was to stay exactly where he was. Logan leaned in, voice low. Tell me to stop. Marco's pulse pounded in his ears. He should have. He knew he should have. But he didn't. Instead, he let Logan's fingers trace higher, his breath hot against his skin. A choice was made, and there was no turning back. Marco woke up tangled in Logan's sheets, the scent of romance and sweat still clinging to his skin. For a moment, he didn't move. The room was dim, the early morning light barely creeping through the blinds. Logan's arm was draped lazily over his waist, his breath slow and steady against Marco's neck. It should have felt wrong. It was wrong. And yet, Marco didn't want to leave. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. His stomach clenched. Daniel. Marco slid out from beneath Logan's arm, careful not to wake him, and reached for the phone. The screen lit up with a simple text. Can't wait to see you tonight. I missed you. Guilt hit like a fist to the chest. He stared at the message, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to say something that would make the weight in his stomach feel lighter. Instead, he typed back, me too? The lie sat heavy in his throat. Behind him, Logan stirred. You leaving? Marco turned. Logan lay on his side, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't conflicted. He had no regrets. Marco swallowed. I have to. Logan smirked, propping himself up on one elbow. I'm not stopping you. That was the thing about Logan. He never asked for more than Marco was willing to give. He never begged, never clung. He just took, and Marco let him. He dressed quickly, avoiding Logan's gaze. As he reached for the door, Logan's voice stopped him. You'll be back. Marco didn't answer, but they both knew the truth. That night, Daniel came home. Marco stood at the door as he walked in, suitcase in hand, his smile easy and warm. He smelled like the airport, like old cologne, and the faintest trace of home. The moment Daniel pulled him into a kiss, Marco almost flinched. Almost. Daniel pulled back, frowning slightly. You okay? Marco forced a smile. Yeah, just tired. Daniel studied him for a second, then cupped his face gently. I missed you, he murmured, pressing another soft kiss to his lips. You sure everything's okay? Marco's chest tightened. I cheated on you. I betrayed you. Instead, he just nodded. I'm fine. But he wasn't. Marco tried to stay away from Logan. For 2 weeks, he ignored the texts, ignored the pull in his chest every time he remembered the way Logan's hands had felt on him. But it wasn't enough. One night, while Daniel was working late, Marco found himself parked outside Logan's apartment, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. He told himself he wouldn't go inside. Then his phone buzzed. "Still thinking about me?" Marco exhaled sharply. He shouldn't have responded. He shouldn't have done any of this. But instead, he stepped out of the car and walked inside. The affair didn't slow down. It grew. It became stolen moments in darkened rooms, hurried kisses against cold walls, whispered names tangled in sheets that weren't his. Logan was heat and hunger, and Marco let himself drown in it. But guilt never left. It followed him home, curled up beside him at night, while Daniel lay next to him, blissfully unaware. Then, the first mistake happened. One night, after another meeting with Logan, Marco slipped into bed beside Daniel. Half asleep, Daniel reached for him, pressing his face against Marco's neck. He inhaled softly, then stilled. "You smell different." Marco's heart stopped. Daniel pulled back, blinking drowsily. "Did you go out?" Marco forced a laugh, rolling onto his side. "Yeah, just drinks with friends." Daniel hummed, unconvinced. His fingers brushed Marco's arm, pausing slightly, as if something fell off. But he didn't push. Not yet. Days later, Marco's phone lit up with another text from Logan. "I need to see you." Marco hesitated, but his fingers moved before his brain could stop them. Where? He never noticed Daniel watching him from the hallway. Expression unreadable. Marco didn't hear Daniel follow him. Didn't hear the soft shuffle of footsteps as he stepped out of the apartment and into the night. Didn't feel the weight of his boyfriend's eyes burning into his back as he slid into his car and drove straight to Logan's place. He only felt the hunger, the need. By the time he reached Logan's door, his hands were already shaking. He wasn't sure if it was from anticipation or fear. Maybe both. Logan didn't even wait for Marco to knock. Just pulled the door open like he'd been standing there, waiting. "Thought you weren't going to come," Logan murmured, leaning against the frame. Marco exhaled sharply, stepping inside without a word. The moment the door clicked shut, Logan had him pinned against it, their mouths crashing together, hands moving fast, desperate. Marco let himself sink into it, into the heat and recklessness of it all. The taste of whiskey on Logan's tongue, the roughness of his hands, the way Logan's body pressed against him like he owned him. And for a moment, Marco wanted to be owned. Then, a knock. Loud, firm, final. They both froze. Logan pulled back, his eyes flicking toward the door. Marco's stomach twisted into a knot, so tight he thought he might be sick. The knock came again. Logan stepped back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Expecting someone? Marco's breath caught in his throat. He knew, before the door even opened, before the air shifted, before Daniel's voice cut through the room like a blade. He knew. Marco. It wasn't loud, wasn't angry. That almost made it worse. Marco turned slowly. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a second, no one spoke. Then Logan, always so fucking indifferent, exhaled a low chuckle. Guess the secret's out. Marco wanted to hit him, wanted to undo everything. Daniel's eyes never left him. How long? Marco's throat was dry. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Daniel, How long?" Daniel repeated, his voice steady, but his hands shook. Marco looked away. He couldn't say it, couldn't admit it, but his silence said enough. Daniel inhaled sharply, nodding. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Wow." "Daniel, save it." His voice cracked. "You don't get to explain this away." Marco reached for him, but Daniel stepped back like the touch would burn. "I gave you everything," he whispered, his voice barely holding together. "And you threw it away for him?" Marco's chest ached. It wasn't just... "Don't." Daniel's eyes were wet now, his face crumpling. "Don't lie to me again." Silence. Then, finally, Daniel shook his head, swallowing hard. "I hope it was worth it." Then he turned and walked away. Marco wanted to chase him, wanted to drop to his knees, beg, undo every mistake, but his feet wouldn't move. He just stood there, staring at the empty doorway, feeling everything collapse around him. Behind him, Logan exhaled, stepping closer. Guess that's that. Marco turned, his jaw clenched. You don't care, do you? Logan tilted his head. Should I? Marco's stomach churned, because for the first time, he saw it clearly. Logan had never wanted more than the chase, the game. And Marco? He was just another conquest. His hands curled into fists. The thrill, the passion, the addiction, all of it shattered, leaving nothing but cold, empty regret. He took a shaky breath and turned toward the door. Logan's voice followed him. You sure you want to leave? Marco didn't answer, didn't look back, because for the first time in weeks, he finally knew what he had to do. And it wasn't this.